But I can certainly say the only difference between someone who wants to be a director and is a director is whether you're directing. And I firmly believe that you can be directing in the basements of bars and living rooms, and that matters.
Welcome to another Newsweek conversation. I'm here with Rachel Chavkin. Thank you so much for coming.
Delighted to be here.
We are so delighted to have you here. I've written down a few things that you've done because you've done so much.
Done some things.
You've done dozens of plays, including Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812.
Yeah.
The Clock, Marco Ramirez, Moby Dick, and of course, Hadestown.
Yeah. I've worked on all of those plays and or with those playwrights.
You were a founding member of the award-winning group The Team.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you won a Tony Award for Best Director of a Musical for Hadestown.
Yes, I did.
Which is fantastic. You had a great speech, which we might also talk about.
Sure. Thank you.
And then you've got one of my favorite artists, Tamara de Lempicka.
Yes.
You'll have a new play about her.
I'm working on a massive new musical about her, yeah.
Yeah. So before we go there, let's talk about how you began.
Sure.
So, I sort of, as our research team was reading up all about you, we learned that you had a love of theater from a very early age, and your parents were sort of supportive and involved in that.
Well, more specifically, my dad loved the theater, and so I grew up in a household getting taken to a lot of theater.
Yeah.
And I think I saw a chorus line on Broadway when I was 4 years old. So I was also not seeing children's theater. I was seeing theater with a capital T, I guess.
Yeah.
And I did love it, but I actually mostly did sports while growing up.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was a soccer player.
No
primarily.
kidding.
Yeah.
Do you still play?
Sadly, not.
Oh,
Sometimes I'll kick a ball around, but no, I'm not on a team.
Oh.
Yeah. I would love to be on a team again someday.
Yeah, it's fun. It does conflict often with things that happen in the evening, like plays.
But this is, in retrospect, I would say it was about 10 years into my company, The Team, before I was like, oh, I named my theater ensemble The Team. Maybe I missed
soccer.
That
was...
Yeah.
That's very funny. So a lot of people want to get into theater. It's not the easiest thing to get into. But you've been incredibly successful in it. Sort of how, tell us about your origin story, how you went from being a soccer playing theater lover to force to be reckoned with.
Oh, thanks. I don't, that's interesting. I don't know if theater is any harder to get into than anywhere else necessarily. And I worked at Barnes & Noble for 8 years as well, and people would apply there every day, and it really helped to know someone who was working there. And I would say for me, getting into theater was a lot through community. I had the great fortune to go to NYU.
Yeah.
So I went to college very late in applying for colleges. I remember weeping in the car with my high school boyfriend and being like, I think I want to study theater. And he was like, that's okay. and I applied and got in and was able to go to NYU.
You applied late and you got into NYU. It's not so terrible.
No, exactly. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
And even more so because going to school at NYU meant being able to see theater 6 to 7 nights a week, often for free or very, very cheaply, because I was able to usher for shows off Broadway.
So it was included in the massive tuition that you...
Yeah, exactly.
Because I hesitate to say that was free.
No, NYU was certainly not free, and that's part of what I mean in terms of the great privilege.
Yeah.
I got a fantastic education, and specifically got it with a whole bunch of professionals who are working in the New York City theater scene. And so I left college knowing a lot of people who could give me advice. And at the same time when I graduated, I think I was as a young director, you certainly never get hired to direct because more than anything, no one trusts you with money yet. And so when I graduated, rather than trying to assist, I was very, very focused on making my own work and self-produced my own stuff, basically with every dollar that I made extra at Barnes & Noble and several other jobs that I was working. And support from adults who I wrote to and asked for money, which
Right.
basically meant they had more than $20 to give me. Rented black boxes, and I remember we performed in the basement of a bar that one of our friends was working at during the days. We were working down there, and slowly that became a company called The Team, which is now 15 years old, and is a company that I'm the artistic director of.
And so a lot of that, as you said, was cultivating the relationships you had in school, getting the relationships you had with other people, and leveraging all of that. And so I imagine that would be the advice you would give to a young person today.
I generally try never to give advice because I think it
I read
presumes
that.
that,
Yes.
you know, that your life is anything like my life.
Yeah.
And I carry a lot of privilege. I'm white. I'm able-bodied. I come from a highly educated family, and so I just would never impose, you know, the given circumstances that I carry on someone else. But I can certainly say the only difference between someone who wants to be a director and is a director is whether you're directing, and I firmly believe that you can be directing in the basements of bars and living rooms, and that matters because you are growing your chops.
You won a Tony Award,
I did.
which is fantastic.
Even more fantastic, Hadestown won 8 Tony Awards.
Yes.
And as a director, like, that's way more meaningful
Yes.
than necessarily the individual stuff.
The team, everything. You made a pretty moving speech when you accepted your
Thanks.
Tony Award.
Thanks.
Do you think it made a difference?
I mean, I worked on that speech. Me and Amber Gray, who is also nominated, is one of my best friends, was nominated in the Best Supporting Actress category, or Best Featured. She and I practiced our speeches to each other, like
Well, you
like
did a great job.
sprinters, and timed each other.
Yeah.
And I hope. I don't know. I think, you know, it's still recent in terms of knowing what the effect of the speech was. I was wildly flattered to find out that both Diane Paulus, the director, and Hillary Rodham Clinton, presidential candidate, Secretary Clinton, cited the speech today in the Women's Day on Broadway.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. I got all these like
pump.
flurry.
Boom!
I got this flurry of texts, and that is obviously wildly meaningful. I think more than anything, what I hope is it took the argument of pipeline off the table. Like, that very simply was my interest, is like, that's actually not an acceptable line. So if it did nothing else but take that off the table as an option for argument about why you're not going to a woman or an artist of color or maybe a disabled-bodied artist, you know, all of those options, then it will have been useful.
Yeah, no, so I think the answer is yes, it did make an impact. I mean,
I don't know. Very often, you know, if you are a member of one of those groups, you don't know what jobs aren't being offered to you. So,
well, and sort of what's interesting, I think, is that everyone's talking. Like, you know, there's a lot of talk about a lot of movements.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see how the data will change, right? Because that takes time.
Totally.
And you know, and I don't think we've seen evidence that the data has changed significantly yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
No, but certainly a lot of, I know the Broadway timeline very well, and that is typically a development process of several years. So I think it will take some time to see.
Yeah. One of the things you said was that the lack of diversity in directing on Broadway is a lack of imagination on the part of the gatekeepers and establishment. How were you at the beginning of your career? Certainly you came from privilege, you're white. So how did you go about making space for yourself? Did you have your own hurdles, or were you so dedicated to directing everywhere you could that it just, you didn't feel them as much as maybe some other people have?
That's a good question. I think, well, because I was very committed to producing my own work and to more experimental work. I basically spent my 20s working entirely in the experimental sphere, either downtown or internationally, including a huge amount in the UK.
So you sort of took an outside lane around everyone.
Exactly. I actually just was like, I don't know if I can say this in this
can say
forum, but
anything.
I had my head so far up my own ass that I actually couldn't even be concerned with what jobs I wasn't being offered, because I sort of didn't even really know, because I wasn't looking at the regional theater or much less Broadway in that way. There were years that passed in my 20s when I certainly couldn't afford a Broadway ticket, and for the most part it was not the theater that I was being drawn to see. I wanted to see William Forsythe's and Anna Teresa de Kiersmacher's work at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and the Wooster Group's work. So I don't really know. So by the time I began really entering into the quote-unquote mainstream world, I was 30 and had quite a track record of making work happen for myself.
And as you already said it earlier in the interview, but that in and of itself is a lesson. I mean, take your own path and go down it.
I totally stand by that.
Yeah.
You can only take your own path.
Yeah. You've taken classics also. Let's talk about Hadestown. You've taken Orpheus's story and you've put it in a mining town. First of all, how did you manage to imagine that? And when you do that, it feels like you have a dual relationship with the original text, sort of both a reverence and an irreverence for it at the same time, which is interesting.
Yeah, totally.
Is that how you actually feel?
Oh, definitely. Reverence and irreverence simultaneously is like, I would say, a core mission statement. I think it describes the team's work. I think it describes my work with Dave Malloy, and certainly my collaboration with Anais Mitchell on Hadestown. And Anais, in 2006, long before she and I crossed paths and joined forces, she had begun crafting this world of Hadestown that is rooted in these very, at the time, very poetic images of the Rust Belt, of mining, of wealth, and guarded wealth and walls. She wrote the song "Why We Build the Wall" in 2006.
Right.
And Anais is one of the slowest, most careful writers I've ever encountered. She's a proper poet, but the song "Why We Build the Wall" came to her sort of, she will say, whole. And so when I joined the project, there was already this wildly rich soil of that imagery and of natural disaster, of an ecosystem that is out of whack as industry and fear has taken triumph over faith and nature and natural cycles. So I really just stepped into that, and as a director had to find the visual balance of making the imagery vivid without making it literal. And that took a number of years to figure out before we arrived on Broadway.
What is it that draws you into a project? So if it's not the type, because you've done them all.
Yeah, I love eclecticism. I don't want to be bored.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you were looking literally for that piece of that's something that's just a little off, a little different. I'm
looking to learn always. I mean, and I really and grow. And I mean that here, but I also really mean that in my solar plexus. And then I have to trust that if I'm not an alien, then someone in the audience will also feel that. And so I think more than anything, that's what I'm looking for in a project.
One of the things that a director does is that you make a lot of changes and we don't see them, right? We just see the final product, right? What's a change that you made that we would never have known about that's sort of had an outcome that you really love? A
huge one in Hadestown was the set. So when we did it downtown, and I guess you would know this if you saw it downtown, originally it was in this like beautiful wooden amphitheater. We described it like a cross between a barn and a Greek amphitheater. And it felt very warm and embracing, but there was no stage space and no room for choreography. We didn't have a workers ensemble at that point. So it was like a very different animal. That was really like almost more concert than theater.
Yeah.
And then we went to Canada and we tried to design it. We went into proscenium and we made it. We tried to make it look like a road to hell, which is the opening image of the show, and that was not good because we literalized the metaphor,
Right.
which is not a good thing to do. It turns out we learned the hard way, and then we actually made a bunch of changes in Canada, and I was very happy ultimately with that production as a stepping stone. But then, as we were preparing for London and then Broadway, we went back to thinking about that barn and that wooden amphitheater, and we were like, oh, the vibe, like we've got to get the vibe back. And so we looked at all these images of Preservation Hall and other great music venues and thought about where you want to go to like receive a great story of old. And that is how we arrived at the design that's currently on Broadway. And then got to, as Aeneas rewrote Wait for Me, which is sort of the central penultimate song of Act One, we got to have this like beautiful, vivid conversation about how does the space need to transform as Orpheus breaks the laws of the space-time continuum to get back the love of his life.
Let's talk about Lempicka.
Sure.
She was awesome.
Tamara de Lempicka was awesome and
Crazy.
complicated and a nut job and sensational and sexy, and I love her.
I'm going to say one of my questions is what brought you to the project? I think you just told me.
Yeah, the music is sensational and this is probably an over-referenced show, but a lot of elements that I see in Hamilton in terms of a strong, literally pop beat.
Yeah.
There is this incredible scope to the music and to the story that we're telling. You know, it stretches from the Russian Revolution in 1917 up to the dawn of World War II, because Tamara was alive in this incredible time and place of Paris between the wars and the sexiness of Paris between the wars. You know, she was known for going to parties and like eating food off of young men and women, off of their bodies. And then the heart, at its core, Lempicka is about a love triangle between Tamara, her husband, a super handsome, arrogant aristocrat named Tadeusz Lempicki, and her lover, Rafaela, who is a woman who was very likely a prostitute and who Tamara painted 7 perfect canvases of. And that's the story of the show.
What is your favorite thing you learned about Tamara de Lempicka during? Because you must have done lots of.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure you knew her, but I'm sure you know her better now.
Yes. Oh my gosh. What is my favorite thing? I love that she was probably pregnant before she got Tadeusz to marry her. And how sexually adventurous she was, frankly.
Yeah. Especially for the time. I mean.
She was uncompromising in this astonishing way, and in a way that really walked an edge for certainly a woman in her time, and a woman who was playing hardball in a boy's world, which is why no one knows her name, but every time I show someone her artwork, I'm making this gesture because I usually do it on my iPhone, every time I show someone her work, they're like, oh, I know that artist. She, you know, one of her most famous portraits is a self-portrait of her in a green Bugatti, and she never owned a green Bugatti, but she was like, I'm gonna have that car. You know, I am that vehicle. I am that velocity, and I think she was sensational.
Rachel. thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's a
Thanks
pleasure
for
to
doing
meet
your
you.
research.
Yep. Thank you for
Yeah.
thank you for thanking me.
Yeah.